Beyond the village path, beyond the hearth and the church bell, beyond the familiar and safe, there is a place most people do not dare to enter. A place where the air feels heavier, the shadows seem alive, and the veil between life and death thins. Some women walked there, not healers in the conventional sense, not midwives tending mothers, not cunning folk preparing remedies. They were something older, something attuned to what most could not see. They spoke to the dead, read signs in gravestones and soil, understood what lingered when the living could not. They carried herbs, iron, salt, and the oldest words, tools to navigate thresholds that terrified everyone else. They were grave witches. And tonight we follow the story of one such woman, a woman who walked at the edge of life and death, guiding both the living and the spirits of the dead. A woman who reminds us that power often lives where we least expect it, and that fear and respect have always been intertwined. Welcome, wanderer.
And thank you for joining us on the path.
This is the Roaming Raven podcast.
A place for old stories, whispered magic, and the folklore that still clings to the hedgerows.
Each week, we'll be guiding you through a tale drawn from witchcraft, folklore, and folk belief.
Stories of cunning folk and wise women, of charms and curses, of herbs that heal and words that bind.
We'll explore the legends themselves,
and then wander deeper into what they meant to the people who told them.
Their remedies, their rituals, their fears and hopes, and the strange, beautiful ways they made sense of the world.
These are not just stories of magic. They're stories of survival, of knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand, of power found in plants, in ritual, and in the spoken word.
So make yourself comfortable, light a candle, pour a cup of tea, or walk with us beneath the trees.
This is Folklore for the Witchy, history for the curious, and a path for anyone who feels called by the old ways.
We are your hosts, Paula and Tracy, and this
is the Roaming Raven podcast.
Can you hear the wings beat? Can you hear the sound? Lifting up the heavy hearts from the frozen ground. It's the folklore of the future. It's the history of now. Taking back the scepter and the iron-willed vow. Slower now, the mist rolls in. The bird begins to sing of every hidden, holy, and forgotten thing.
The Witch of Ashwood Churchyard. In a village called Ashwood, the graves were long and uneven, and the soil was soft with centuries of rain. The churchyard stretched far beyond the church itself, tangled with ivy and nettles, and the stones leaning like tired old men. A woman named Morwenna lived at the edge of this graveyard, in a house half sunk into the hill. Ivy crawled up her walls too, and dried herbs hung from every rafter. Sage for protection, yarrow for health, and rue for courage. Bones of animals, polished smooth, were tucked into corners. Some villagers whispered that she slept with one eye open, always watching. Morwenna was no ordinary healer. Villagers went to her for remedies and blessings, yes, but she also walked the stones at night, reading the marks in soil, listening to the sighs in the wind, speaking quietly to those who had no voice left in the living world. One autumn evening, a young mother approached her gate, pale and trembling. Her child had died unexpectedly, and no priest could comfort her. Morwenna followed her into the graveyard, carrying a satchel of herbs, iron pins, salt, and candles. The wind was sharp, tugging at their cloaks and hair. Morwenna whispered prayers to the soil, blessings for the child, and lit candles in a circle around the grave. A figure emerged from the shadows, not quite human, but not quite spirit. The villagers never saw it, but Morwenna recognized the signs immediately. The veil had thinned. The air hummed with presence. She spoke in low, measured tones, coaxing the restless soul. The mother trembled, and then, slowly, a warmth settled in her chest, a sense that her child was at peace. Word of this spread. Mothers left offerings of bread, milk, and salt at Morwenna's gate. Shepherds, though, would cross the road to avoid her path, fearful of drawing attention from the dead she communed with. Some claimed they heard her chanting in the night, calling spirits by name, the wind carrying soft replies that sounded like laughter or sighs. One night, a man approached her after the bells had tolled for midnight. His father had died suddenly, and the family wanted to know if the spirit lingered. Morwenna took him to the edge of the graveyard, lighting candles at each grave along the path. She placed a circle of salt and iron at the headstone, whispered words in an old tongue, and invited the man to speak aloud. The air grew still. Leaves stopped rustling. For a moment, the man felt the presence of his father, not frightening, but calm. He wept quietly, and Morwenna whispered, "Do not fear what returns, but do not follow it." The villagers' fear of Morwenna, though, grew. They whispered that she consorted with spirits, that she could raise the dead, and that her eyes saw too much. Some claimed to see flickering lights near her windows at night, hear murmured voices, or catch glimpses of a tall, cloaked figure moving silently through the stones. Despite the fear, Morwenna continued her work, and she kept meticulous notes, etched symbols into scraps of wood and stone, hung protective herbs in windows, and buried small charms under graves to maintain balance between worlds. She never demanded payment, only respect for her knowledge and her craft. But the villagers' fear deepened. They began to cross themselves when passing her gate, and murmur prayers under their breath, and leave offering for themselves as protection. And Morwenna understood. Her work was necessary, but also dangerous. One stormy night, the wind howled through the graveyard, bending the trees and scattering loose stones. Morwenna knelt among the graves, lighting candles, placing salt and iron in careful patterns. The air shifted, heavier, charged with unseen eyes. A presence approached her circle. She didn't flinch. She whispered the proper words, offering guidance, protection, and peace. And by dawn the wind had settled, the graves were still, and the villagers found her home empty. Some said she'd been taken by the spirits she served. Others whispered that she'd walked into the next world herself, leaving behind only the herbs, iron, and whispered songs. Even today, people crossing the Ashwood churchyard say, if you listen closely on a still night, you can hear a woman's voice, soft and low, calling the names of the departed. They call her the Grave Witch, the woman who stood between life and death.
So, what do you think happened to her? Where did she go?
Mystery, huh? Well, I guess two obvious choices. She went to the spirit world, or
She got caught.
What do you think?
Well, they would have known if she'd been burnt at the stake locally. Surely a great big spectacle would have been made of her.
That's a good point. So let's go with a more romantic view, shall we? Let's be hopeful that poor Morwenna got away.
Yeah, okay. When we look at folklore, grave witches are some of the most fascinating figures.
They really
and
are.
Also some of the most misunderstood. Unlike cunning folk or midwives, they didn't just work with herbs or health. They worked at the threshold of life and death, and that put them in a seriously precarious position.
Didn't it? Exactly. I mean, the folklore always puts grave witches at graveyards and crossroads and abandoned scary places that humans instinctively avoid because they're connected to life and death and the unknown, the scariness of it all. And grave witches, of course, they were often called to help families navigate sudden deaths or plague or some tragic accidents, using their herbs and their words, charms and rituals to protect both the living and the spirits of the dead.
And folklore is full of specific motives. The woman who speaks to the dead, the one who senses restless spirits, the one who knows which grave needs tending, which corpse is troubled, or which burial must be marked with salt, iron, or protective herbs. These motives often appear in European folklore. The recurring theme is always the liminality. The witch lives where the ordinary world ends and the other begins.
That's true, isn't it? And one interesting pattern is that grave witches were often connected to midwives or women who worked with birth and death, because life and death were inseparable in folklore. The same woman could guide a baby into the world, but also help the recently departed transition. And just as in last week's episode, this wasn't an evil person, she was a guardian of thresholds.
Folklore also emphasises respect and fear in equal measure. Villagers might call the grave witch for help, but they also whispered about her in cautionary tones. Stories warned, don't disrespect graves, don't linger at night, don't mock the woman who walks the cemetery. This kind of duality, reverence and fear, is central. The witch's power is real in the story because it stems from knowledge, intent and proximity to death.
Absolutely. And there's a fascinating symbolic layer too, isn't there? Graves themselves are liminal spaces, and the witch's tools, the salt, iron, candles or herbs, they're all about creating boundaries and clarity. We've got salt to purify, iron protects, candles guide, herbs connecting life and death. The folklore makes it very clear. The witch isn't malevolent. She's simply mediating fear, chaos and the unknown.
Yeah. We also see recurring narrative lessons in folklore. Those who ignore boundaries face misfortune. Children who play in graveyards without respect. Livestock left unprotected, or families who fail to honour the dead. These are often the story's warnings. The grave witch ensures order, both practically and spiritually.
Yeah, and it's interesting that across regions, from one place to another, she can appear in slightly different forms. So for example, in Scotland, she might be described as seeing ghosts or warning of impending death, whereas in Ireland, maybe she guides souls with herbs like mugwort or vervain. Perhaps in England, she might sprinkle salt, iron or rue to protect the living. So the motifs vary, but the underlying principle is consistent. She stands at the boundary. She's respected and feared. Feared because she's necessary.
It's also worth noting that folklore preserves the social and psychological function of these women. In a time when death was ever present and the unknown could terrify a community, the grave witch provided a framework for understanding mortality. Her rituals, her words and her presence offered reassurance, a sense that someone could walk safely where the living dared not go alone.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I think that's why her stories endured, because she's both practical and symbolic. Practical because she worked with herbs and charms and the knowledge of death's rhythms, and symbolic because she reminds us that fear and mortality and the unknown, they require very careful tending. She's the archetype, really, isn't she, of the guide at the threshold, a figure who navigates the space between worlds so that others don't have to.
Yeah, so in short, the folklore of the Grave Witch is a mirror. It reflects human fear, human reverence for death, and the need for someone, often a woman, to hold the boundary, to create safety and meaning when none seems to exist. She's literally terrifying, only because she reminds us of our own vulnerability, and necessary because she shows us that courage, knowledge and ritual can make the invisible bearable.
That's a good point. And when we look at her through that lens, we start to understand why these stories survived for so long. They weren't just about superstition. They're about acknowledging the unseen, respecting those boundaries, and maybe honouring the delicate dance between life and death. That's what makes the Grave Witch one of the most enduring and compelling figures in folklore, I think. So, what do you think? Should we go on and talk about the herbs? We've met Morwenna, we've set the scene. Let's talk about what she actually used, what she carried with her. Because her bag was not just filled with random plants. Every herb had a purpose.
And not just a practical purpose, a symbolic one too. The cunning folk understood that plants work on multiple levels, body, mind and spirit, all at once. Let's start with sage. What was that for?
That's for my Sunday dinner. And apart from that, it was, and still of course is, used for purification. So Morwenna would have used it to cleanse spaces such as the graveyards before she entered them, and burning sage cleared the air both physically and spiritually. After all, we use sage smudge sticks, don't we? They're still a really common tool.
Yeah.
It's one of those herbs where the practical and the magical are impossible to separate.
And rosemary?
Also for my Sunday dinner, but also for memory and remembrance. You still find it planted on graves in old churchyards, like a living tribute to those who passed. But it was also for endurance. If you had a long night ahead, such as sitting with the dying or keeping vigil over the dead, rosemary helped you stay present.
Oh, I didn't know that. So what about rue? That's one I don't know very well at all.
Less known. It's a fascinating herb. It's bitter and very strong, and it was used for courage, specifically courage in the face of death. But it was also protective. So if you were dealing with spirits, if you were walking the boundary between worlds, as Morwenna was, rue gave you strength to hold your ground.
And then there's yarrow and mugwort. They come up a lot, don't they?
They do, yeah. We've talked about them quite a bit before. So we've got yarrow for wound healing, stopping blood, but also protection and divination. And then mugwort for dreams, visions, spiritual clarity. These two really were the workhorses of the Cunning Woman's Garden.
Yeah, they've come up in a lot of our stories. So garlic. Of course, I have plenty of that in my own kitchen.
Yes, you want to avoid the vampires, don't you? It's everywhere for a reason. So it warded off harmful influences, both the ones you can see, like infection and illness, and the ones you can't, such as evil spirits or malicious intent. And people hung it in their homes, carried it in their pockets, rubbed it on door frames.
So did they actually eat it at all?
Well, you'd have to think so, right? And anyway, with the smell in the Middle Ages, you'd want to smell something better than pongy people that didn't wash very often, I imagine.
So the herbs did double duty, physical protection and spiritual protection all at the same time.
Exactly. And they weren't working alone. So Morwenna would also have carried or had around her, maybe in her cottage, salt, iron, water and candles.
Right, salt for protection. Yeah?
Absolutely, yeah, always. Sprinkled in the corners, across thresholds, around a bed. We use salt to create a boundary. Iron could have been a nail, a knife or a horseshoe. Does the same, but it's sharper. It's the metal of boundaries. And water for cleansing, blessing, washing away what clings. And candles, of course, for guidance, light in the darkness, focus for the mind, or a flame to carry intention.
So none of these things were just like objects. They were used with words as part of a ritual.
Exactly the way we talked about charms in an earlier episode. The herb, the salt, the iron, they gave form to the intention. The words and rituals gave it structure. Together, they created a container for fear, a way to navigate the unknown.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because modern herbalism still echoes all of this.
It does, doesn't it? Walk into any health food shop today and you'll find rosemary for memory, sage for cleansing, yarrow for wound healing. We might have lost the language of spirits and fairies, but the practical knowledge, that's still been passed down from generation to generation, unbroken.
So Morena's garden, it's not really gone, is it?
No, not at all. It's still growing. We just have to know how to look at it.
I love that. So, we've talked about the herbs themselves, but let's dig into how they were used, because Morena wouldn't just hand someone a bundle of sage and say, good luck with that then.
Well, we would hope not, right? Let's hope she would give them a little more help than that. And the herbs were part of something bigger, rituals, charms, intentional actions, and those rituals served a very real purpose.
Okay, so what was that?
Giving order to chaos. So when you think about what these women were dealing with, we've got graves. They're really dangerous places, not just physically, but spiritually. They're liminal spaces. The boundary between living and dead is very thin there. So if you're going to step into that space, you're going to want some structure. You're going to want some rules.
So charms were the language women used to protect the living while they worked in the presence of the dead.
Exactly that. And that language took many forms. So iron pins pushed into door frames or carried in pockets, thread tied in knots that could bind or release, and salt, of course, sprinkled around graves or across thresholds.
And I've read somewhere about charms written on scraps of parchment, sometimes buried with the dead and sometimes carried by the living.
Of course, small bits of paper with words folded into them, tucked into clothing, like you said, or hidden in the grave itself. And the words were part of the protection. Those words often rhymed, or maybe they repeated certain phrases.
So why the rhythm? Why the repetition?
Because rhythm and repetition do something very interesting to the mind. They create focus. So they slow things down. When you're chanting or speaking in a structured way, you're not just rambling into the void, you're directing your intention. You're building, let's say, a container for the fear.
That makes perfect sense to me. So they also had candles arranged in circles. That's another form of that same impulse, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's say a circle of light, a defined boundary. It says, here is sacred space. This is protected space. So nothing crosses this line without permission. It's visual, which really helps. It's tangible. It's something you can see and feel.
It would be easy to look at all this and just call it superstition.
Yeah, you're right, it would. But here's the thing. Ritual has measurable effects on the mind. And psychology backs this up completely.
It's really interesting. And of course, they didn't know that then, did they?
No, not at all.
No. So what kind of effects does it have?
Well, for example, it lowers anxiety. It can focus your attention. It gives you a sense of control in situations that are fundamentally uncontrollable, such as death. When you're facing death, either your own or someone else's, you can't fix it. You can't make it not happen, but you can have a sense of control by performing a ritual. You can light a candle or sprinkle some salt or speak certain words. And that act, however small, helps your mind cope.
So when the grave witch combined herbs, ritual and word, she was doing something remarkably sophisticated.
She really was, yeah. She was treating the body with the herbs and treating the mind with her rituals. And she was also acknowledging something that every culture throughout history has acknowledged, that the living and the dead don't exist in completely separate spheres.
Really real, very human.
And also very, very old. Okay, so let's talk about some of the symbolism and reflection in the Grave Witch. The Grave Witch is a symbol of the threshold, that space between life and death, certainty and mystery, or grief and acceptance. She reminds us that there are places in life that demand courage simply to enter them. Not everyone is willing or able to face them, and yet someone must. And that's where she stands, quietly, steadfastly, between worlds.
She's also a symbol of knowledge and skill that lives outside the mainstream. Her power was not in dark magic or malice, it was in her ability to read the signs, understand the unseen, and act with intention. She used herbs, iron, salt, words and ritual to create order in chaos. In a way, she represents all the women whose knowledge was practical, spiritual and necessary, yet feared simply because it was beyond common understanding.
Absolutely, it's tragic, isn't it? And another layer of her symbolism is protection and boundary making. Every grave she walked, every ritual she performed was about setting limits, guiding spirits, keeping the living safe, and maintaining this balance between worlds. And I think there's a lesson here for us. The unseen, the unacknowledged, the uncomfortable. These spaces often hold the work that keeps communities alive, both emotionally and spiritually.
Yeah. She also embodies grief, remembrance and human resilience. In folklore, death was not sanitised or hidden, not like it is today.
No.
Children died, midwives feared complications, plagues swept through villages. The Grave Witch didn't deny death, she worked with it, held it in her hands and helped others navigate it. She gave form and ritual to fear, turning chaos into something that could be acknowledged, respected, managed.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a modern sense, she speaks to the ways humans continue to seek meaning in the face of mortality. You know, it's the one thing we've faced for thousands of years and we still struggle with it. Our rituals and memorials, our grief practices, such as lighting candles, creating altars, journaling, they all echo the work the Grave Witch used to do. So she reminds us that human beings need guidance when stepping into the unknown, and that what might seem strange or magical often has profound psychological and communal value.
She's also a reminder of courage and ethical responsibility. Standing at the edge of life and death, she had to act with respect, intention and care. Misuse or carelessness could harm others, and yet she persisted because someone had to hold that space and there was no one else.
No.
There's a powerful lesson in that for anyone who works at the edge of understanding, whether in medicine, psychology, spiritual guidance, or even daily life.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, isn't it? And I think also she teaches us about the invisible labour of empathy. She had to demonstrate such a level of empathy. The grief she guided, the fear that she managed, and the balance that she maintained. They're not just flashy acts. They're quiet, patient, and often misunderstood. So the Grave Witch reminds us that some of the most important work in life happens in these liminal spaces, unseen, but absolutely vital.
And in the end, the Grave Witch is not just a figure of folklore, she's a mirror, a reflection of what it means to live courageously at the edge, to acknowledge fear, to protect others, and to work with the unseen forces that shape human life. She lives in our stories, in our rituals, and in the spaces where we honour life, death, and the connections between. When we think about the Grave Witch today, It's easy to imagine her only in folklore, only in shadowed, spooky graveyards. But her work, guiding people through grief, holding space at thresholds, using ritual to navigate fear, it's still very much alive. It's just taken on different forms.
Hasn't it? Absolutely. I mean, look at grief counsellors or hospice workers. They stand with people at the edge of life. They help families navigate the dying process. They comfort the bereaved and offer guidance for what can feel pretty incomprehensible. So in a sense, they're like modern grave witches, aren't they? Creating structure and meaning in moments that could otherwise be chaos.
Yeah, and it's not just clinical care. Spiritual guides, mediums and shamans also carry echoes of the grave witch. They create rituals, offer counsel, and provide a framework for understanding the unseen. People still seek their help to process loss, to honour ancestors, and to acknowledge the invisible threads connecting us to what has passed.
And in fact, even rituals that we might take for granted nowadays have roots in these practices. So lighting candles on All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day rather, creating memory altars for loved ones, or holding a vigil. These are all echoes of those charms and candles and protective words that people like Morwenna had. They help people process the grief, maintain the boundaries, and mark those transitions.
And it extends further. Birth and end-of-life care are modern thresholds where the same principles apply. Midwives, doulas and palliative care nurses work with deep respect for life's transitions, creating sacred space, guiding families through fear, and using small rituals, a blessing, a chant, a candle, to offer focus and calm.
Absolutely. And even outside of formal care, people still create their own private rituals. Think about journaling after a loss, or leaving flowers at graves, holding personal ceremonies, or maybe meditating on ancestors' lives. All of these are different ways that we use to navigate the liminal space between living and dead, and past and present. And I think these practices just give structure to chaos, just like the grave witch did.
Yeah, every funeral is about that structure, isn't it? So many days to prepare for it, then the funeral itself and the wake afterwards.
Yeah.
It's all part of the ritual. And it's fascinating how modern science supports some of this. Ritual and intention have measurable effects on the brain. They reduce stress, lower anxiety, and allow people to process grief in a tangible way.
Yeah.
When we honour thresholds with intention, we physically change how our body and mind responds to fear and loss.
So Morwenna's work wasn't just mystical, it was deeply psychological. She created space for the living to acknowledge death, ritualized grief, and processed fear in a community setting. And that's something we still crave today, something that modern grief and spiritual practices continue to provide.
And in a broader sense, the grave witch reminds us of the value of presence. Sometimes her magic wasn't herbs or words. It was simply her willingness to be there when others could not face what was coming. Her courage, her patience, her empathy, these are qualities we continue to honour in those who work at the edges of life, death and the unknown.
Exactly. She stands as a bridge between worlds, a reminder that humans have always needed guidance at life's thresholds. So her practices might have looked strange or magical to her neighbours, but actually they simply met a real need. They remind us that boundaries, rituals and careful attention are timeless tools for navigating the unknown.
And perhaps that's the lasting lesson. We still need the grave witch, even if she wears no cloak and carries no herbs. We still need her courage, her wisdom, and her ability to walk with us where life and death meet. When we look at the historical record, there are more than a few real-life cases that echo the folklore of the grave witch. Women who are accused of consorting with the dead, performing rituals at graves and walking the liminal space between life and death. One of the most striking examples comes from 17th and 18th century England in rural villages where death was ever present and superstition guided daily life.
So you're thinking of the woman named Joan Peterson, for instance, who was executed, sadly, in 1652 in London, and often cited as a cunning woman accused of necromancy.
Necromancy? What's that?
The practice of communicating with the dead, especially in order to predict the future. I guess you're thinking of crystal balls right now, aren't you?
I guess.
So, back to Joan. While her case was extreme, it highlights a common theme. Women who were known to deal with illness, death, and protection charms were very easily misunderstood or feared. So her work wasn't just about healing others. She helped families navigate death, misfortune, or grief. But that suspicion, of course, as we know now, could turn deadly.
And then there's Mary Bateman, sometimes called the Yorkshire Witch. She lived in the late 1700s and became notorious for claiming she could see spirits and communicate with the dead. Mary offered guidance to families who had lost loved ones and performed rituals intended to protect them from harm or even locate lost items. What's fascinating is that Mary's powers were based on clever observation, herbal knowledge and ritual skill, much like the grave witches of folklore. She collected fees for her services, yes, but her work addressed real human fear, uncertainty about death, loss, and the unknown.
And these accusations, they didn't just happen in a vacuum, did they? Think about England at that time, a place of high mortality, very limited medical knowledge, and quite rigid social structures. So if a woman like Mary or Joan performed rituals that were unusual, or if she could predict death or illness in a family, that knowledge was both respected and feared. So one little misstep or a neighbour's suspicion or a tragedy could easily label her as a witch overnight.
And there are countless smaller, less famous cases as well. Across rural England and the Scottish borders, midwives and grave watchers were sometimes accused of raising the dead or using bones and graveyard dirt for curses. In reality, many of them were practical women recording details, making protective charms and advising families about spirits or grief. Practices that helped communities cope with death.
Absolutely. And in many cases, these women simply worked with the reality that the living didn't understand.
Yeah, and that's a recurring theme, isn't it, through all our stories?
Yeah.
Grave witches were necessary. Their work was liminal. They stood at the threshold between life and death, often performing what we would now call grief counselling, psychological support or spiritual guidance. They managed fear, brought closure and offered ritualised comfort. And yet, because their work was misunderstood, they were often accused of wrongdoing.
Yep. And this fear of women working at thresholds is echoed across Europe, and countless records of women are accused of walking with spirits, raising the dead, or performing protective rites over graves. And these cases weren't about random evil. They were about control, fear, and a society that simply didn't understand women's knowledge.
The historical record makes it clear grave witches existed in a complex space. They were healers, guides, protectors, sometimes feared, sometimes sought after, and the folklore preserves that duality perfectly, respect and fear intertwined.
So when we tell the story of Morwenna, the grave witch, we're not spinning a simple tale. We're touching on a real human history, a history of women walking at the edges of life and death, helping people to navigate what was invisible and terrifying, and often at enormous personal risk.
So, as we leave Ashwood Churchyard tonight, we can see that the grave witch is far more than a figure of superstition or fear. She is a guide, a guardian, a mediator between worlds, her work was practical. Herbs, rituals, charms, and deeply human, addressing grief, fear, and the unknown.
Exactly. From sprinkling salt, iron, and protective herbs at graves to speaking words that brought calm and closure, she worked where most people simply could not. She offered structure in chaos, ritual in uncertainty, and courage in the face of death. And the stories that survived reflect that delicate balance: fear and respect, awe and necessity, life and death.
She reminds us that boundaries matter, the spaces between life and death, joy and grief, known and unknown, they need care, intention, and attention. The grave witches' practices show us how humans have always sought to walk these thresholds safely, and how ritual, intention, and presence can make the invisible tangible.
And while we may no longer walk the graveyards at night, her legacy lives on. In grief counselling, in hospice care, memorial rituals, and personal practices, we continue to honour thresholds and guide the living through the edges of life. So her work echoes in lighting a candle for the departed, or journaling to process grief, or simply holding space for someone who's in mourning.
So in the end, the grave witch is timeless. She embodies courage, knowledge, empathy, and the ability to walk where others cannot. She reminds us that fear does not have to paralyse, and that understanding and care can make even the most terrifying spaces navigable.
So, the next time you find yourself at the edge, whether facing grief, uncertainty, or the unknown, remember her. Remember the grave witch standing quietly at the threshold, holding space, offering guidance, and showing that even in the shadow of death, human connection, ritual, and care can bring light.
Her story is a reminder. Courage, empathy, and knowledge are the oldest forms of magic, and some of the most important work we do in life and in death happens quietly, unseen, at the edges.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Witch Lore. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us. We'll be back soon with another story from the hedge and the hearth. Until then, may your path be curious and kind. From Paula, Tracy, and all of us at Roaming Raven, blessed be.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider giving us a positive review on whatever platform you're listening on. Thank you to Georgia Rolls for our wonderful artwork, and to Psych Witch, who wrote and produced our music. Find more of her lovely sounds on Spotify. This podcast has been produced by Roaming Raven.
Roaming through the history.